Okay. All right. So just to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way up front, just want to let everybody know this presentation is being recorded and we'll make a copy of the slides available for everybody after the class later today. We should get that email out by the end of the week. I'm also going to send a complete copy of House Bill 913. That's what we're going to be covering today. Um, so just to give everybody a heads up, that document is a 191-page PDF. Nice little doorstop for you. And there's no way I'm going to get through all the detail that it covers, but what I am going to try to do today is focus specifically on the things that have changed as of July 1st of this year. Also, just to be clear, this presentation is not a CEU class. There is no credit given today for managers or board members, so there's no need for you guys to give us any license numbers or follow up about that. This is just for information's sake, but I think that you will find it to be a very good use of your time. For those of you who have joined us with our other webinars, you may remember that we usually do a quarterly series of 3 webinars. The first of which we call our Fundamentals of Reserves class. And those that have attended that hopefully will understand that's a great introduction to the concepts of reserves and budgeting and reserve studies. Our second class in this series is what we call reserve funding methodologies. That's a little bit of a higher level overview into the specific concepts of straight line and pooled reserves. And then what we typically do in this third installment in the series is what we call Ask a Reserve Specialist. But since we've gotten a ton of recent questions this year and even going back earlier in the spring about this newest piece of legislation, House Bill 913, we went ahead and just retitled today's class to House Bill 913 and SIRS, All You Need to Know. Just to be clear, that is probably a little bit of a lofty title because there is more that you would need to know beyond what I'm going to talk about today. My focus is going to be specifically on the changes to the structural integrity reserve study requirements that we have in this new bill. But I would just want to let you know there's a lot more that could be said about other aspects of the bill that are changing. I think there's plenty of law firms and management companies and other groups that are putting out very good content in that regard. So if you're a property manager or a board member or just somebody in the industry who's interested in what has changed, then today's class is for you. I'm going to go through about 20 or so slides covering the material, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. So as I've mentioned before, feel free to begin asking questions anytime using that Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar there. Okay. So before we get into the material, I'll take just a moment to introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. As I said, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for our company, Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008, and I've completed or overseen over 5,000 reserve studies in my career. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist, which is an industry-specific credential that's only awarded to people who have demonstrated their experience and expertise in preparing reserve studies. That designation comes from CAI, the Community Associations Institute. Now, that said, because I'm going to be giving some insights today on a new piece of legislation, I do want to point out very clearly, I am not an attorney. Okay, so none of this is official legal advice. I definitely encourage you to talk with your association's legal counsel if you have any questions or concerns or would like to get more information on anything here. Also, this is all still very new. Okay, this bill was only signed very recently. It became law on July 1st. We are recording this today on July 15th, 2025. So if you are watching this at some point in the future, it may be possible that things may have changed by then. Certain interpretations may be different. Additional laws may have been passed. So this is kind of time-stamped as information as best we know it here on July 15th. If you're not familiar with our company, these are just some of the types of properties that we work with. So as you can see, we have a very broad range of client types, which include private schools and church facilities, large-scale master associations. Some of you might recognize Fisher Island up there in the top right. That's been a long-term client of ours, as well as golf and country clubs. And of course, what's relevant to us today, all different types of condos, co-ops, and other types of community associations. Our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the US. We've been in business since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. Including myself, we have a total of 25 people on our Florida team, which represent a very wide variety of technical backgrounds, including engineering, architecture, construction management, business, and accounting. As of right now, 10 of us on our Florida team have earned that RS credential, and we will soon have several more that should be earning that within the next year or so. I always like to point out we've been very fortunate to be recognized with a Reader's Choice Award for the last 12 years in a row by the Florida Community Association Journal. So a big shout out and big thank you to those of you who have supported us in that over the years. If you'd like any additional information, you can visit our website, which is reservestudy.com, or you can feel free to shoot me an email. My email address I will have up on the screen at the end, but I'll tell it to you now, is wsimons, that's WSIMONS at reservestudy.com. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do today before we dig into any of the new changes is just do a quick recap on what the existing requirements are. So I think most of you in the audience will be at least somewhat familiar with the changes that have taken place in the last couple of years. I have done some similar presentations in prior years talking about previous versions of the SIRS requirements. Some of you guys might remember I did sort of a book report type of format in 2023 when Senate Bill 154 came out, where I went through a sort of a who, what, when, where, and why type of framework. And of course, we all know that the why in this case was the tragic collapse of the Champlain Tower South building that happened just over 4 years ago, June 2021. And unfortunately, I think that these days that has become somewhat of a memory for a lot of people. And I guess want to say up front, I think we owe it to the 98 people who lost their lives that night to always remember why so much has changed in our world and our industry since that time, and for good reason. So let's go back to 2022. That's when we had the first iteration of the legislative response to that tower collapse. That took place in the spring of 2022 with Senate Bill 4D. Now, if you remember, that was the first time the Florida legislature introduced the concept of what we now call a structural integrity reserve study, which we often abbreviate as SIRS or SIRS. The biggest major changes to those first requirements took place a year later in 2023 under Senate Bill 154. Those of you who remember that bill might recall that's when the requirements were trimmed down a little bit. That was getting rid of some of the things like building foundations that really didn't make much sense to include specifically as requirements there. That was also when the types of providers were expanded to include reserve specialists and professional reserve analysts. So beginning in 2023, really, I guess probably middle of 2023, I think that's when the real start of the major wave of demand for these SIRS began and continued certainly all throughout 2024. Also in 2024, that's when we had House Bill 1021 passed. That included some additional reporting requirements and other requirements for board members. But in 2024, there was really no major overhaul to anything related to the SIRS. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the present day. Earlier this year, the legislature passed House Bill 913. That was earlier this spring. It was then signed into law and took effect on July 1st. So really just 2 weeks ago. And I want to point out we may not be done yet. Okay, we're halfway through the year. It's only a matter of months before the legislature will start planning again for its next session, which is actually going to begin starting January of 2026. So in case anybody needed a short refresh on what a SIRS is, this is the section of the text that really defines it. And, again, we'll send out the slides for everybody to read these on their own. If you think I'm going a little bit too fast, I apologize, but I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So what I'll say on this definition here is that if you take out the words structural integrity from this piece of text, what you have left is pretty much the classic definition of a reserve study. Okay, it's a physical analysis of a property, which is based on a visual inspection that is then used to create a financial analysis that the property will use to make sure it is forecasting and budgeting for major projects. Okay, kind of paraphrasing what it says there, but really that's what a reserve study is. This notion of a structural integrity reserve study was just kind of a new wrinkle on that concept that's been around for decades. Okay, this should look familiar to most people. The list of components that are specifically stated in the bill for the SIRS, okay, We see these letters A through H here. You can read those for yourself. Most of them pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. I'll point out that the statute, which is mentioned under letter B for structure, that statute defines a primary structural member as a structural element designed to provide support and stability for the vertical or lateral loads of the overall structure. And it also defines a primary structural system as an assemblage of primary structural members. Okay. So the only thing that has changed here compared to prior years is what I put there in red in letter H, okay, where we're talking here about other items that might be considered structural in certain circumstances. Okay, the only change there is that they have raised the dollar threshold from $10,000 to $25,000. Okay, now where that comes from, this is actually a piece of information that's been in statute 718, 719 for quite a long time. The dollar threshold has been $10,000 for decades. And I think the legislature this year just wanted to kind of modernize that, really make the focus on significant elements of the property. So this change actually is beyond what's just in House Bill 913. This now applies to all condos and co-ops in the state that they will have to reserve for roofing, painting, pavement resurfacing, and anything over $25,000. Okay, so those of you who may not be in a 3-story property or more, we're just doing conventional reserve studies, conventional budgeting, that number has also changed for you. The other thing I'll point out there is that in the text, it actually says roofing, painting, and pavement resurfacing regardless of cost, and then items that are $25,000. So with regard to the SERS list here, I think that same interpretation would apply. I would think that it's probably roof, structure, fireproofing, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing, windows and doors, regardless of cost, and then other items that exceed $25,000. Okay, otherwise, most of the details, the process for a SERS hasn't really changed. Okay, we're still talking about properties throughout Florida. That's, not just limited to coastal properties. This is anywhere in Florida. Specifically, it is for condominiums and co-ops that are 3 stories or more in height. There are a couple of exemptions for very small buildings. Okay, if you have a 1 to 4 unit building, then you are exempt from this requirement, but there's not very many of those out there. The SERS must be based on a visual inspection, and then once it's completed, that document has to be reported to the DBPR and provided to the membership within 45 days. So really none of that has changed. All of that is the same as it was in years past. So now that we've kind of taken just a little time on that, let's focus on what has changed in this year's bill. So as I was putting this presentation together, I really wanted to keep it concise. And so in the interest of time, trying to make this as straightforward as I can, and wanting to allow plenty of time for questions, I'm going to speak somewhat briefly on some of these points. But what I've done for you is to cite the specific page number and even the line numbers for the relevant text within House Bill 913. So you'll see that at the bottom of these next series of slides here. Everything that I'm going to talk about is either copied straight from or paraphrased from these particular lines. Would encourage you, if you're curious, to go ahead and read those on your own. Like I mentioned, we will be emailing out a copy of this complete presentation and a copy of the bill to go with it. So that can be your homework assignment. If there's anything that I was mentioning today that you're curious about, feel free to consider this a guided tour, and then you can take that long form bill text and get the full context there. So the first change that I want to highlight is the fact that the deadline for obtaining the SERS has been extended. Okay, it's now December 31st, 2025. Up until this point, going all the way back to 2022 and Senate Bill 4D, the requirement was December 31st of 2024. Now, I think that was originally a pretty lofty goal considering the number of properties in Florida that are subject to these requirements. And it wasn't terribly surprising that by the end of 2024, a fairly small fraction, I would calculate maybe a quarter to a third of the properties in Florida that meet the criteria had actually met that deadline and reported that to the DBPR. Okay, so looking ahead to the end of this year, right, which is now less than 6 months away. I would expect there's still going to be quite a few properties that will not have met this new deadline either. But very important to point out that along with this deadline change, with this extension, there are some additional powers of enforcement that were put into this year's bill. I'm going to cover those right at the end of the presentation today. Okay, so who is capable or who is allowed to do the SIRS in the first place? There was a subtle but important change that was made this year regarding who is actually qualified to prepare a SIRS. So actually in prior years, the text said that any person qualified could actually prepare the document, but that the visual inspection of the project of the property must be performed or verified by an engineer, an architect, a reserve specialist, or a PRA, a professional reserve analyst. In this year's bill, they crossed out the text stating that any person could prepare the study itself. So I doubt that this was happening very much over the last couple of years, but I'm guessing maybe there were some instances where someone like an accountant or a property manager, maybe even a board member, was taking on the responsibility of preparing the SIRS for their property, basing that report off of somebody else's inspection. But that's no longer going to be allowed. Okay, from now on, it's only one of these four qualified experts that can do the SIRS for any given property. Okay, the next big change that went into this year's legislation was the addition of some language intended to require transparency and to prevent conflicts of interest. Okay, so to be specific, that would mean that design professionals such as engineers and architects, right, who are perfectly capable of doing a SIRS and are allowed to do so, but could have some other interest in the property. Okay, that could be bidding on a contract for concrete restoration or painting as an example. If that's the case, those folks would have to disclose that disclose that in writing before they submitted a proposal for the SIRS. Unfortunately, I think that is the specific result of some unfortunate circumstances where there were some providers of SIRS reports completing those studies, which meant providing opinions on the conditions of the property, and then quickly changing hats and offering to be the ones to conduct the necessary repairs. So I have heard some anecdotal stories of at least a few providers out there using something like a $5,000 SIRS report as the springboard to a project management fee that maybe was worth quite a lot more than that. So that's not to say they are prohibited from doing it, but anybody who is one of these design professionals or a contractor under Chapter 489 must disclose that in writing. So if you're a board member out there soliciting proposals for your SIRS, that might be an additional question you might want to ask if you're engaging with any engineers or architects is, if they have any interest at any point in offering any other services to the property. If so, that needs to be disclosed up front. Okay. So I can tell you from having spoken quite a lot with the legislators and staff members themselves that the focus on financial flexibility, on easing the burden of costs for residents was the main goal of this year's legislation. And I think that's a good thing. If you haven't felt it yourself, I'm sure that many of you have at least heard of the anxiety and the frustration that has come along with making these big budgetary increases in a fairly short amount of time. So what they did this year was to try to institute some changes to try and fix that or at least alleviate it. Okay. So as I say on the screen here, loans, lines of credit, and special assessments can now be incorporated into a SIRS and treated as part of the funding plan. There is a specific caveat here, which is that the funding from those sources has to be immediately available to the board without further approval of the members. Okay. So for example, that doesn't mean that a board could say, look, a year from now, we plan to take out a loan for a project, right? That's a hypothetical situation. This could only be done if that loan has already been secured, those funds are immediately available. Then the provider of the SIRS can recognize that and take that into account. Okay, same goes for a special assessment. If the special assessment has been passed and is collected, then the provider of the SIRS can show that and show that any projects that will be paid for using those funds, those alternative sources, whether that's lending or special assessment funds, we can go ahead and extend the remaining life expectancy on those assets to show that they're going to get paid for with that money and not from reserves this time around. So the bottom line result of that is that they will be able to reduce their budgetary need for reserve funding by having those alternative funds available. Okay. Another one where there's quite a lot of text on the screen. So again, you'll want to read this over on your own time. But the short summary here is that if you are in a property that has already completed a milestone inspection within the last 2 years, and if that milestone inspection uncovered some substantial repairs that need to be dealt with right away, you are now actually allowed to pause your reserve funding for SERS for these next two budgets. Okay. Now, this will only apply to budgets adopted before the end of 2028. So this is not a perennial pausing that is going to be allowed. This is a short-term relief, but I think this will be a welcome relief for properties that have had to deal with some of these major costs that came about as a result of milestone inspections in the last couple of years. Okay, going hand in hand with that, I'll point out another new requirement is that if that association concludes those projects and they want to begin resuming their reserve funding, they actually do have to have a new SERS done to show what their new reserve amounts will look like. Okay, so that's a temporary pause. That may be very advantageous to associations, especially if you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of work to do from that milestone. But you will need to resume reserve funding again in the future and to get a new study at that point in time. All right. Another new aspect going along with this theme of financial relief. Okay. One of the biggest reasons that we have always heard, okay, a lot of board members, a lot of folks arguing against the purpose of funding the reserves is that there's the sentiment that residents can get a better return on their money if they keep it in their own pocket, right? That they can earn higher returns, and then if they have to, they can pay a special assessment. Now, I don't disagree with that, but the problem with that is that when those owners have that money locked up in their own portfolios, it stays with them. Okay, if they move away, if they pass away, that money never makes it back to the association. Okay, so that's kind of the whole problem that has resulted in a lot of these situations we're in is, not enough money being held by the association to pay for its assets. So what's happened now is that we have this new language. It's been added to allow the boards of directors to be a little bit more creative, more aggressive with how they invest those reserve funds, right? Those of you who have been around a while, typically reserve money can be only sitting in very boring accounts like CD accounts or money market funds that are never going to put the principal at risk, but are also never going to get the same return as a lot of other investment vehicles. So this new language in House Bill 913, this is meant to allow associations to make, quote unquote, prudent investment decisions that hopefully will get a better return. Now we'll see how this plays out over time. I am hopeful that this does well for associations. I will just give you my advice. If you're considering this, I would highly recommend working with some professional advisors, investment advisors, CPAs, attorneys. Make sure that when you're making these investments, you also carefully consider the need for liquidity. Okay, and that's a great way you can use your reserve study. See what projects are coming up and when, and make sure that you're going to have liquid money on hand when you need it. All right, another thing that has changed in this year's legislation has to do with the requirement or the frequency of updating the SERS. Okay, so on the first bullet point there, up until now, the legislative requirement called for mandatory updates at least once every 10 years. And as I put in the brackets there, if you've adopted the SERS funding plan, then you're okay. But as of now, there are some additional circumstances that would trigger an update to need to be performed. Okay, so as I mentioned a few slides ago, loans and lines of credit and special assessments can be part of a funding plan now too. But anytime those are going to be used, the SERS has to be updated to reflect that, right? Consider it, a financial checkup with your SERS provider to show, look, we have some new circumstances here. We have money that we didn't have before. That's perfectly fine. That's good. But you need to update your SERS so that the funding plan is taking that into account. Okay, in addition to that, and I think this is going to be very relevant for properties this year specifically, the SERS has to be updated before any budget is passed in which the funding of reserves does not align with the most recent SERS. Okay, for example, many associations last year took advantage of that final opportunity to have their membership vote to waive or to partially fund their reserves. That was perfectly legal to do at that time, but that would mean that the recommended funding plan that they had in their SERS no longer applies. Okay, the reason is that those studies would have included a dollar amount for 2025, which was never collected. As a result, the amount of money that would have been projected to be on hand in 2026 is no longer correct. Okay, therefore, it's not possible for the next year's budget to be in alignment. Okay, I spoke with a executive from a management company recently who said, we were very diligent. I think almost all of our properties got the SERS done by the deadline, but something like 90% of them chose to waive their reserve funding. So what do we need to do? And what I told him is, look, according to this new law, they have to have an updated SERS done. Now, listen, that does not mean you're starting from scratch. That does not necessarily mean a complete overhaul of the entire SERS. Most professional providers will be able to do something called an update with no site visit. Okay, that'll be much quicker and a fraction of the cost than the original study, right? If we were just there last year, there's probably no need to do another visual inspection of the place. But this would be a quick kind of desktop update to show, look, you didn't follow the 2025 plan. That's okay. But now we need to come up with a new plan for 2026 and beyond. There we go. Okay. So here's another way to kind of explain that concept, just using different terminology. Okay. Let's say I was telling you how long it would take you to drive from Miami to Jacksonville. Now, if I told you to leave at a specific point in time and drive a certain speed, and we checked the traffic and we saw how much traffic there was going to be, we could reasonably predict when you would arrive. All right. But let's say that you abandon that plan and you started a few hours late. Well, if that's the case, now you're not in alignment with the same plan that I gave you, right? You're not going to end up at the same place at the same time. Maybe there's now an additional 2 hours of traffic you're going to deal with. That means we'd have to come up with a new plan based on the fact that you started later. The same goes for reserve funding. Okay, if you wait a while, you will likely have to do more to play catch up. Okay, this one is a kind of a subtle change, but I thought it was worth pointing out. Another nice thing in this year's bill is that they have specifically defined the term baseline funding in Florida statutes for the first time. Now, just so you know, this term has been in existence for quite a long time as part of the reserve study standards through CAI. So I see this as just a nice way of making things consistent between Florida statutes and existing industry terminology. So if you're not familiar with what that means, baseline funding means that you're designing a funding plan that makes sure you never completely run out of money, right? Each year as cash goes in and cash goes out of your reserve account, you have to at least make sure that each fiscal year has you starting above zero. That's what baseline funding means. Okay, those of you who might have attended our reserve funding methodologies course, you might remember we do a very deep dive on this and show how baseline funding compares to threshold funding and full funding. But this is a very nice thing. I think the state has done a good job here just to call it what it is. Baseline funding, okay, is this technical requirement. And that, the notion of it, the requirement from a financial standpoint hasn't actually changed here. This is always what was required at minimum for associations. To me, it's just now being called by its proper name, which is a good thing. Okay, with regard to the reporting requirements, there's only one significant change to talk about here. The first two things you see on this list, these were already in existence, which is that as of last year, the requirement said you have to distribute a copy of the completed SERS within 45 days of receipt and also to report that to the DBPR. So that reporting process, I will certainly acknowledge, I think was a little bit clunky when it first came out. It got a lot smoother over the course of 2024. There was an online database that was established where associations could go online and do that. The only additional requirement this year that's beyond that is that an officer or director must now sign an affidavit acknowledging receipt of the SERS. That's a little bit more of a strict legal requirement. It's certifying that it's been done. So if you're an officer or a board member out there that is going to get a CERS this year, make sure that you do that. Some people have already asked me, well, how do we do that? And my answer is to consult your legal counsel. The DBPR has not put out any stock, affidavit form that I'm aware of. I think it could be just a simple one-page document on, legal letterhead identifying yourself and affirming that you've received that. So talk to your legal counsel. I'm sure they'll be able to help you out with that. I don't have a slide on it, but I will say there is going to be one other significant change with regard to the DBPR, which is that by the end of this year, in fact, by October 1st of this year, the DBPR is going to create a much more comprehensive online, portal or database for all condo properties in the state. Okay. And that's going to require an annual kind of refresh. They're going to need contact information for all board members, for property managers. They're going to need certification that whatever necessary documents were obtained during that year. Up until now, I think this is one of the problems with this CERS reporting process is that the state of Florida, believe it or not, just didn't really have a specific, organized, comprehensive database showing all of the condos in the state. And so they've been granted additional money this year and a direction from the legislature to create that database. So stay tuned for more on that. That's going to be taking place over the next several months, but come October 1st, that database should be live. And then I believe it's by February 1st of each year, every condo association in the state is going to have to keep their information up to date there. So stay tuned for that. That'll be a nice thing to have, but it's not available yet. Okay, so last topic here before we jump into the Q&A. If anybody has additional questions, please feel free to go and hit those on the Q&A button on your taskbar. John and I will start going through those in just a few minutes, but I want to talk about and close with what I think is maybe the most important aspect of this year's new legislation. Okay. So as I mentioned at the end of last year, the data provided by the DBPR showed that only about a quarter to a third of properties, it was about 6,000 condo associations had completed their CERS, right? Again, we don't know exactly how many condos there are in the state that are 3 stories and above, but I think it's probably between 15 and 20,000 if we had complete data. Okay, so only a small fraction actually got it done. Now, I think there maybe were some good reasons for that. We can talk about the fact that initially there was that pretty short timeline given. There were some legislative changes that happened from 22 to 23. There were not very many good providers available in the early days. But that is now kind of settled and there's a lot more capacity now. So going forward, the DBPR has been given some expanded power to enforce compliance with these statutes. Okay. It was already true that if an association was willfully and knowingly failing to meet the requirement, that the board of directors could be found to be in breach of their fiduciary duties. As we've talked about before, there are potential consequences that come along with that. You can be dropped by your insurance company. You can have difficulties obtaining lending. There were specific disclaimers that would have to go on to any units in a building that were going up for sale and so on. But there's more now. Okay, and that's what I have in this kind of bottom paragraph. So just to let you know, the DBPR has been given additional authority to impose fines of up to $5,000, which in some cases could even be charged individually to board members. Okay, besides that, those same individuals can also be removed from their position as a board member and prohibited from rejoining the board for a period of time. So for those of you who are board members, or if you're managers who work with board members, this is very important. This is new, and there's much stricter consequences now for breaching this statutory responsibility. So you want to pay special attention to these new requirements. Make sure you're doing everything you can and that you need to do to stay in compliance. Okay, so as I said before, we've got the source material listed there. We'll be sending out the documents to show you where we got all this from. And if you have any questions, please let us know. But at this point in time, John, if you're ready, we can dive back into the Q&A. So I'll flip my camera on here, and with your help, we'll start going through the list.
Absolutely. We got a lot of great questions, and I'll do what I can to try to lump similar questions together. But we actually had a question that just came in that's relative to a couple of other previous questions. The question reads, do you recommend removing any components of less than $25,000 from the SIRS and non-SIRS? Doing this will add cost, which in some way must be added to operating. Is it better to leave them in to stretch cost over several years?
Great question. I am of the mindset that every association is different, and $25,000 for some properties is not the same as $25,000 for other properties. Okay, so if you have already had a SIRS done or already had a reserve study done, and you have these components in there that are below that dollar threshold, my advice would be probably leave them there, right? You already have been funding towards them. There's already money in the bank for them. If you remove these things from your reserve study, from your reserve plan, remind you that does not remove them from reality. You're still going to have to pay for these things whenever that project comes along. Um, and so if you take it out of the reserve study or the SIRS, you're just counting on the fact that your operating budget can absorb those costs whenever they come along. So, listen, that's maybe a different burden if you're a 30-story high rise with a multi-million dollar budget. If you're a 20 unit building with very few assets, just changing it from 10 to 25,000 might introduce a new level of risk for you if you haven't been funding for those, or if you just, they kind of slip by the wayside and you're assuming that you can just absorb that in the operating budget. So my advice would to be careful with it. It is legally allowed, but understand the consequence of doing that either way.
Sure, great. Along the same kind of question as that, if an association were to opt to remove said components, would they need an updated reserve study or would they be able to make the adjustment on their own accord?
Um, well, I guess the board of directors is always ultimately responsible for what goes into the budget. So if they have a SIRS done and the SIRS provider has agreed to taking that out, then they can prepare their reserve schedule accordingly. If not, right, if it's just the board wanting to do that on their own, then I would say you probably do want to have your SIRS updated because I believe in the statute it says that it is legally required to base your budget off of the SIRS specifically. So you would want to make sure those are kind of in harmony with each other.
Excellent. We've got a couple of questions here related to lines of credit and things of that nature, so kind of want to group a couple of these together. But we have a
Mhm.
question here that reads, can the interest and the loan fees be considered a SIRS expense or must they be consumed by the operating fund?
I think that would make more sense to leave that in the operating budget. Yeah, your reserve components, kind of by definition, are for repairs and replacements and upgrades and modernizations of physical assets. Kind of accounting costs like that, I think, should always belong in the operating budget.
Sure. Along the same lines, can a loan or line of credit be obtained and deposited into a SIRS to satisfy the SIRS funding for that year, but not actually be immediately used?
As I understand the question, I would say yes. I think if the funds are immediately available to the board of directors, then you can have your SIRS done to show that, right? So let's say there's a community that has borrowed $1 million. They have that available. It's available to the board without further approval by the members. And if they say, look, we're going to use this money to replace our roof and do a painting and restoration project, what we would do as the service provider would be to look at the roof and the painting project and reset the life expectancies on those components and put in the notes to the study to say that, look, the association has obtained a loan for this project. The work is going to get done going forward. We're treating this as if it was new again. And so the funding recommendation in the reserve plan is for the next instances of those projects. So yeah, the real significant requirement there is that the funds have to be readily available. It can't just be an idea or a tentative plan that the association wants to do.
Excellent. A couple questions here related to the affidavit and reporting process. The first question, just to reiterate, do you know if there's an affidavit available and where, if there is one, where to obtain?
I don't know if there is one available. That there may be one. I don't, I think I would have heard about that if there was. So again, my advice would be to talk to your association's legal counsel. It should be a fairly simple process to get that done, and to provide that to the DBPR. But I would like to see that there would be a kind of a stock, language or even just an official one by the DBPR that they would provide, but I'm not aware of that existing right now.
In the same realm of the affidavit, if a SIRS was done last year, does an officer or director have to submit an affidavit backdated to when the report was completed?
Yeah, another good question. I don't know. I guess again, I'm not an attorney. This is a very new requirement, so I don't know how much of it might be applied retroactively. To be on the safe side, I would say maybe that is a good idea, just to say this was the date we got it. Here's our file, or here's our form. I think anybody looking at the dates would say, okay, well, if you got the study in October of 2024, many, many months before the affidavit requirement was created, I don't think there would be any punishment for that. But just to kind of dot your I's and cross your T's might be a good idea just to have that on file.
Sure.
Certainly
And
any additional ones going forward.
and again, relative to the reporting of the SIRS, how can we make sure the DBPR has our filed report?
Yeah, so this is a searchable database. If you just do a Google search or you go to the DBPR's website, it's very easy to find. I would just search for, DBPR SIRS reporting database. And there's actually two databases you might find. One is the building reporting database. That's something different. That was created in 2022 when they were just looking for all buildings that were 3 stories and above to kind of self-identify. Um, the one you want to look for is the SIRS reporting, and you can search by building name, and get a pretty quick response there just to see that and confirm that is there.
Excellent. A lot of good questions coming in. Want to try to pick the ones that will pertain to the most. So
Right.
we have a question here. Just to confirm, the deadline for all condos to perform a SIRS is by 12/31/2025, the end of this year.
That's correct. Yeah. If they haven't done it already, that is the new deadline. That's right.
Excellent. We have a question.
Unless, I guess, maybe there's a small caveat there. I think if an association is doing the SIRS in conjunction with a milestone inspection, then I think they would be granted an additional year. I think by the end of 2026 would be the absolute deadline, but that's only if they're doing it in conjunction with a milestone.
Excellent. Question here reads, a board can now change straight line SIRS reserves to pooled without a community vote. Is this true of traditional reserves as well?
I believe so. Yeah. I think the legislative intent here was to, again, in the spirit of easing the financial burden, to make it easier on associations and reduce their the cost to the owners. One way that we know for sure they can do that is to pool the reserves. And so I think, along with a lot of other people, pointed that out to the legislature that, look, there's a lot of boards out there that believe in the concept of pooled reserve funding, but have their hands tied, right? They're not able to just make that switch on their own, or I guess to be more specific, to not move existing reserve cash from a straight line account into a pooled account. And so I believe that the intention of this year's legislation was to allow that without the approval of the owners. That I would like to get an attorney to weigh in on that just to see if that is true. I talked to one CPA last week who said that, yeah, it's absolutely clear they can change the accounting method, meaning if they want to pool the reserves from now on, no problem. But that was always allowed. I think the bigger hurdle was taking existing money that's in a straight line account and moving it into a pool. I think the intention of this year's legislation was to allow for that, but I'll kind of retract my answer or amend it depending on what other people might have to say later on.
Excellent. A couple of good questions here. One reads, if you replace a SIRS scheduled item before the scheduled useful life expiration because it's necessary to do so, do you then need to have an updated SIRS report completed?
I think that you probably would want to, because you want to take advantage of the fact that that remaining life expectancy is now longer, right? That will, all else being equal, that will reduce the amount of money going into reserves. If you've reset the clock on something, right? You flip that hourglass upside down again, now the amount of money needed to go towards that thing can be extended. So especially if it's a big ticket item, if it's, 6 or 7 figure expense, I think that it's probably in your interest to do that, whether it's mandatory to do that. Again, we look to the text and it says at least once every 10 years, mandatory, or if any time the reserve funding plan is not in alignment with the most recent SERS. So you would have to kind of look and see if the change to the bottom line there would somehow put that not in alignment with the most recent SERS. And if so, go ahead and adjust that. But again, that might be a good thing for the association to do.
Excellent. Another question here reads, one moment. Can you have a planned future special assessment to offset current SERS funding? The example given is a $3 million project in 2030, where the membership approves a $2 million special assessment that would not be collected until that date.
Definitely not, right? So that would be considered a balloon payment that is still specifically prohibited under Florida statute. So yeah, there's not an option for a board sitting in power today to say 5 years from now, when we have this big project, those unlucky people who live there at that time will pass a special assessment for it. Lucky them. Um, that's an unfair burden to be shifted into the future. And so it's prohibited. You can't do that. You would have to take that into account now and begin saving for it over the remaining 5 years so that by the time that project happens, you have the money set aside for it. I guess if it's a non-structural component, you could still waive the funding for that if you get a 51% vote of the owners to do so. But you still would have to disclose that. You still can't place that special assessment years out into the future and enjoy lower budgets in the interim until then.
Excellent. Got a question here. Do SERS and non-SERS funds need to be held in separate bank accounts?
That's a great question for a CPA, so I would ask them to double check my answer. But to my knowledge, the answer is no. I think that you can have structural and non-structural reserves sitting in the same account at the bank, provided that on your accounting, on your balance sheet, that the funds are listed separately. So the reason for that is that you cannot use structural reserve money for non-structural purposes. Okay, you can't use money that's meant for the roof replacement and use that to remodel the lobby. That is specifically prohibited. So it makes sense that you would keep them separate. It might be easier to have two different bank accounts for that, but I don't know that it's legally required.
It's a great question regarding the deadline. Question reads, if we already have a SERS completed, does it need to be incorporated into our 2026 budget, or is it extended to 2027 because the deadline has been extended to December 1st of 2025?
So if you've already had your SERS completed, okay, I guess the question is when was it completed? If it was done in 2024 or 2023 even, and you're still funding according to that plan, your funding is in alignment with the recommendations there, then you would not need to do a new one. But if you happened to waive the reserves or do less than what was recommended, then you have to do a new SERS before any new budget is adopted. So I guess the question there is when was the most recent one done? If it was just done this year, in 25 for the 26 fiscal year, then I would say that you want to just follow the recommendations in that plan. Remember that this is the first year when association memberships may not vote against the funding of reserves. You may pass special assessments and borrow money and take that into account, but there's no option to not do it at all.
Right. I think the important part there is that they no longer have the option to push it down the road. If it's for
Right.
your 2026 fiscal year, that's when the funding needs to start.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
we have another question here at the top that I think this is important to bring up because obviously House Bill 913 includes a lot more than just structural integrity reserve studies. Now, this question we may not have an answer to, but it pertains to some other language in House Bill 913. The question reads, please address the storing of videos of board meetings. So the question specifically says, what happened to the advice we've had for years of only recording actions taken at meetings and not extra discussions? So again, I don't know that we have that answer, but it's important to note that there's a lot more included in House Bill 913 than just structural integrity reserve studies.
Yeah, thanks for the setup on that, John. I totally agree with you. I spent what 30 minutes or so talking about a 191 page bill. So there's no way that we covered everything that people need to know. I would definitely encourage you to look for similar webinars, presentations being given by attorneys, by law firms, because really that's their domain, and they would probably have a lot more accurate things to say. For me, I think, videotaping meetings is important. I would definitely err on the side of caution and try to capture everything there, but not being an attorney, I'll leave it to them to speak more on that.
Going back to our prior question regarding the deadlines and budget approvals and things of that nature, the question came in, is this for budgets approved after December 31st of 2025 or budgets for the time period after December 31st of 2025?
Okay. Well, I'll try to capture that question. I mean, almost all associations, 90+% of associations have a January to December fiscal year. And so when we're talking about the SERS being obtained by December 31st of 2025, in almost all cases, that's going to be for the fiscal year beginning January 1st, 2026. In reality, they probably need to have that budget adopted by, October, November at the latest. Um, but if you're in a split year, right, a July 1st to June 30th fiscal year, or April 1st to March 31st, I believe the deadline still would be that you have to have the study completed by December 31st of this year, but it may not take effect until the start of your following budget. So if that's July 1st of 2026, then the recommendations in that SERS would take effect then.
We have another question here. Are reserve study updates that are done between the visual walk down studies, as they call it, or as we call it, with site visit update, are they required to be submitted to the DBPR?
This is a really interesting philosophical question for me, actually, that hasn't really been clarified. And I'll just frame it in a different way. If you're in a condo or a co-op that's 3 stories or more, does every reserve study you ever get from now on constitute a structural integrity reserve study? Um, to me, that's kind of an open question. I have asked this of legislators, of staff members at the government, and I don't know that we've really gotten a clear answer on this. I would treat it that way. I think that if you are in a condo or a co-op that is subject to the SERS requirements, okay, you're 3 stories and above, I would treat every reserve study you get from now on as if it was a new SERS, right? It's going to have the same stuff in it. It's not like if we come back out to your property, we're going to turn blinders on and look at different elements of the property. It's all the same things. In every year's budget, you're going to be obligated to separate SERS money and non-structural money. Um, as far as whether you need to report it to the DBPR, I guess we'll have to wait to see what that answer is as we go forward. I would treat it that way, though. Err on the safe side. I think having a recent SERS has some advantages for other reasons too. If you're getting a loan from a bank, if you have potential buyers who want to buy into your property and they're asking about a SERS, having one that's very recently done, I think has some advantages to it. But whether or not you absolutely have to report it to the state, again, we've heard different schools of thought on that. But I would personally, my advice would be to treat it as if it is.
Excellent. Question here reads, please confirm the definition of 3 stories is 3 stories of habitable living space. Example, they give garage on the first floor and 2 stories of condo units above, they say would not be subject to the SERS requirement, but is still subject to fully funding reserves.
That would be my takeaway, yes. The SERS requirement, certainly for the milestone inspection requirement, has now been adjusted to say 3 habitable stories. So if you have, like you suggested there, imagine a building down in Key West where you've got a kind of a sacrificial garage floor on the first floor, and then you walk upstairs and now you're in the first floor of the unit, which is really the second floor above ground, and then another one on top of that. The definition of habitable stories, I think, would mean that under this law, that's actually a 2 story building. The first floor is not habitable. But I would double check that. I think you want to check with your attorney just to be sure. There is also, I will always say there's a possibility that there's local government requirements that might have different mandates. I know with specifically for milestone inspections, there's what's required by the state, but local jurisdictions might have slightly shorter timelines or different requirements that they want to see. I know I'm being vague on this answer, but I would double check it. I think that the spirit of it is they want to focus on three habitable stories. But before you take that to the bank, I would get an attorney's opinion.
Perfect. Looks like we have time for one, maybe two more.
Yeah.
So the question we have here says, please clarify the 2-year SERS funding waiver.
Right. So that's if you have had a milestone inspection done within the prior 2 years, from now, and if that milestone inspection resulted in a substantial amount of repairs that needed to be done, you may pause your reserve funding so that you can focus the attention on paying for those immediate needs. And then you can resume your reserve funding in a later year. So that's the 2 year pause that we're talking about. That will not be possible for any budgets adopted after 2028. But as of right now, that was one of the forms of financial relief they wanted to give to owners, especially in these, older buildings that just did these, very eye-opening milestone inspections and found that they had a lot of work to do and pay for. They're giving them a break. They're saying you can pause reserves for 2 years while you sort this out and then catch back up again after that.
Next, the next question here reads, with the increased DBPR authority added in the bill, is it your opinion that the state is trying to ensure compliance? And did I hear you correctly that now board members may be individually penalized if they do not have a SERS completed by the deadline?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump back to the last slide here on this one. So again, this bottom box here is, effectively copy and pasted from the statute. And I underlined the word individually here specifically. It does say the division may impose a civil penalty individually against that should say officer or board member who willfully and knowingly violates this chapter and so on. So yeah, that is new. They're trying to hold people's feet to the fire. They do not want associations to just go out and get a SERS and not follow it, not report it, certainly not to avoid doing it in the first place. This is, again, as we talked about in the beginning, the result of a terrible tragedy that happened. And the state is very insistent upon taking this responsibility to not let that happen again. So they are being very stringent now and saying that there are some additional penalties, not only possibility of fines, but again, removal of the board member from their position on the board and prohibiting that person from rejoining the board. So yeah, it's very, very important that you pay attention to that and do what you need to do to comply.
Excellent. Got one more quick question here we'll take
Sure.
real quick. We
Yeah.
says in the SERS studies I've seen, there's no reduction after the quote catch-up years, which results in a projection of millions in excess in future years. Is the only way around this to do updates of the SERS funding once it's caught up per se.
Yeah, so important to point out a reserve study is a long-term forecast that is done in the present day. And it's absolutely expected that things will change over time, right? As you do these projects, you will want to update your funding plan accordingly to show that you've done them, and hopefully that will bring down the need for funding, especially if you do things earlier than you anticipated, or if maybe they cost less than somebody anticipated. That's all to the good. So yeah, you want to update your SERS, at least every couple of years. Kind of the long-standing best practice in our industry has been to do an on-site visual inspection about every 3 years. And then the in-between years, it's very good to do these kind of no site visit updates. So what you're looking at now in terms of a 30-year projection doesn't mean it's going to play out that way. But I might also challenge the way the question is framed. They're saying that there's millions of dollars in excess. A good reserve plan may show that you have millions of dollars on hand in the future, but if it's done right, that means that you needed millions of dollars on hand. That is equal to the value of deterioration of your assets. So that's, we talk more about kind of the concept there in our fundamentals class and our reserve funding methodologies class, which I would definitely, make available to anybody who wants to know a little bit more just about kind of the nuts and bolts of reserve planning. But yeah, we're just over 2 o'clock now. So I think just to respect everybody's time, we'll call it a day. John, great job. Thank you for your help with that. Everybody out there, thank you for joining us. A lot of great questions. I know we didn't have time for just all of them, but please feel free to reach out. Stay tuned. We'll have more to say next month and going forward as these things play out. We're always available if you have any questions or if you would like to discuss your situation. If you've had a SIRS done, great. But if you didn't follow it, that may need to be done again. If you haven't done one, right, if your association has not done one at all, remember that deadline has now been extended, but with some potential consequences for not meeting it. So we'll leave it at that for now. Again, thank you everybody for joining. We'll send out a follow-up email, should be later this week, with the recording, the slides, and a complete copy of HB 913. But we'll sign off for today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.